This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I'm thinking about those of you who wore Christmas ties today. You probably weren't expecting these lessons. The sun and the moon will pass away, the heavens will be shaken, all of this. And frankly, the verses of the hymns kind of emphasize a lot of that anxiety and chaos that is spoken about. When I was in the Holy Land, I was preceded there by a couple weeks by the former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann. And the press release that she gave about being there was about how all of the things that she was witnessing throughout the Holy Land were things that were letting her know, and she was wanting to tell all of us that the end is coming soon because of all of those things. And I have to tell you, I had quite a different kind of experience. Because I don't know about you, but I'm hard-pressed to find a time when there weren't people sitting in churches and kneeling and praying and experiencing their own anxiety that weren't identifying with this scripture where Jesus is talking about the end of all things, right? I don't think right now looks much different than the 1930s or the 1860s. There was reason to think about all of that, except we didn't have the technology to get up close and personal with the stars as we perhaps do now. So I don't think that this discussion of the end of all things, I think it's important to understand the context that it has in Luke's gospel. Look at it, and it talks about when all of these things have taken place, then you'll know your redemption is near. So the preliminary is the end of all things. And the main event is what God's going to do next. The idea that all of these things that fill us with anxiety, and if we get online and find other people who can magnify our anxiety, we can really get upset, maybe even lose sleep. That's just the preliminary. The main event is God bringing redemption to the whole world, not just to you and me. Now, so I think it's an incredibly important context to think about. These scriptures, there are in the lessons that we've read today, there are several things that we're asked to do. Most of the things we're asked to do have absolutely nothing to do with the stars and the moon going away. In Jesus, in the gospel where Jesus talks to us, what does Jesus ask us to do in the face of all of this? He asks us to stand up, keep our head up, and pay attention. In the reading from 1 Thessalonians, Paul is talking to this church that he built at a very difficult time and through a very difficult process for himself. He's writing to this church, and he's telling them that his prayer for them is that God would allow them to increase and abound in love. And we have the collect, the prayer at the beginning of the service that talks about now in the time of this that we are to put on the armor of light. Now in the time of this mortal life. We're not to put the armor of light on when we get to heaven and become sunbeams. We're to put on the armor of light now, in the middle of all sorts of things that cause us and perhaps everybody all over the world to be filled with anxiety. So we are given some tasks. One of the tasks that we're given is to be alert, to stand up, to pay attention. And so now is when I steal from Eric, because Eric puts out a weekly newsletter called The Sustainist. His ministry is about assisting congregations and communities to develop sustainable missional communities. And so the idea of things that don't just get you through a rough patch, but allow the church to learn how it might sustain its sense of purpose and mission is what that is about. And in the most recent issue, Eric was talking about a congregation of 30 people. And from what I understand, talking to Eric about it, their age demographic would make ours look like kids. This congregation of 30 people was getting ready for their annual rummage sale. Now, isn't that just about as churchy a thing as you could do? Have the annual rummage sale? And of course, the expectations for the rummage sale are all about making money so that we can keep being church, right? So that we can pay the bills, pay the lights, everything else. This congregation decided that they were going to change the game plan a little bit. They were going to do something different. First of all, I want to get it off because I don't want to forget it. They first were going to make sure that all of the price tags on items were considered flexible. Now, this is really not the way the church operates, because the church really wants to make sure they get all $5 for that vase that most people get for free when they get flowers and they leave the vase. But the church wants to make sure it gets the $5 for that. But this congregation decided they were going to make these prices flexible. And the second thing, and really the absolutely critical piece, is they designated 10% of their membership to be roving listeners during the rummage sale. And the idea was that this rummage sale was no longer just about how we do things for the church, but how we build relationships with the people who come to the rummage sale, people we encounter around things to do with our church. So these roving listeners were assigned not to funnel people to the expensive, high-ticket items, but to listen, to get to know them, to hear their stories. Now, think about this. A significant part of people who come to church rummage sales aren't coming because they couldn't find what they wanted at Nordstrom's, right? They're coming because they might find themselves financially challenged and are hoping for a good deal not too worn from a nice church. Susan and I benefited from this greatly when we were in seminary. We had a church nearby that there was kind of a pecking order of rummage sales up the Gold Coast of Chicago, and we were at Holy Comforter. So that church did about $70,000 worth of rummage sale on one weekend. And throughout the whole year, they stuffed every niche in the church with things that they could sell that one weekend of the year. 80% of the janitor's time was spent stuffing and unstuffing that room for that. When the folks who were behind the rummage sale found that the new rector thought they ought to be paying for some of that sexton, too. It was interesting. But as seminarians, we got first pick the day before they let anybody else to the rummage sale, and they were incredibly flexible with prices. Susan reminded me on Thanksgiving that the turkey roaster that we were using this year is the turkey roaster we got for 50 cents? 50 cents at Holy Comforter rummage sale. So again, the people who come to rummage sales are looking for value. They're looking to improve their life in a way that doesn't require a credit card. And so the listeners were asked to listen and to pay attention to what people were talking about, what their interests were, what their needs were. and essentially to develop relationship with the folks who came for the rummage sale. And then they had a debriefing afterwards, and one of the stories they had a variety of stories to talk about what they learned from people, but one story stood out. And actually it was the only story that was written in there, so it's the one that I have. That one of the listeners was connected with a mother and a daughter, and the daughter had found a dress that she really liked. And the mother took it down and saw the price tag and then put it back up, and they moved around. But the listener was kind of connected with them, talking with them, and noticed that the little girl kept her eye on that dress throughout the whole time Mom was in the store or in the rummage sale. And so the roving listener, on their own volition, took the dress and said, "Here, you need this dress, and there's no cost." And so that's the kind of thing that might happen. The idea that the rummage sale was no longer about just building up St. Swithin's, but was actually about connecting with the people and the different needs and the different communities that surround the church. In the same way that 849 we're beginning to build a relationship with them and calling them into relationship with all of the people that work and live and walk through our neighborhood. Now, here's the challenge. Here's the Advent discipline piece, because Jesus and Paul ask about or raise up some things that we need to pay attention to. What if, like we have pew shepherds, how many of you know what pew shepherds are? Okay, there's still a few people. Tell somebody else what pew shepherds are after the service. Not during the sermon, okay? After the service. Just like we have pew shepherds, what if you thought of yourself as a roving listener? And I don't want you to do this during church because I want you to pay attention to the sermon, but over the coffee hour or on the street afterwards or at a family meal together or at an event with friends and other folks, what if you were a roving listener and you were following Jesus' command that you keep your head up, that you pay attention? Because it's all about God's redemption that's drawing near. So what if, as a roving listener, you were listening to people's story and you were thinking through, wow, what's going on in this life? What might I do to connect with something that helps them to know that they're cared for, that they're loved? How does being a roving listener change the nature of ministry at St. Paul in the Desert? Instead of being about a place that's always trying to figure out, like with our pledges and everything else, make sure you give so that we can keep doing our stuff, the roving listener idea is about us being the body of Christ in every place that we go, and then what we hear and what we learn comes back, and we use it to guide and direct and choose the kinds of ministries that we develop, the kinds of relationships that we encourage, and the places where we've learned that relationships have just dropped through the net and we've really forgotten about them. The second thing Paul asked is, he asked his people, and I believe he's asking us, to pray that God would give us the grace to abound and increase in love. Now, do you see how that connects with the roving listener? Okay. And finally, back to the collect, because I love the image. Put on the armor of light, now in the time of this mortal life. We put on that armor of light when we pay attention. We put on that armor of light when we listen. Because in our hearts, the things that we listen are being connected with the things we heard from Jesus. Maybe even once in a while the things we heard from Paul. And as those things are connected, we begin to make relationships and we begin to build up the body of our community, and we are faithful to what Christ is calling us to. Now, I'm not one who thinks that the stars and the moon are going to go away before December 24th. But I believe that everything we do to put on that armor of light, prepares us to welcome Jesus when he comes, to welcome the stranger, to welcome the person in need, to welcome the person that has a blessing that if we don't ever listen to them, we'll never hear it and they'll never get to share it. I believe that being a roving listener may just be the way that we prepare for Christmas. Amen.